Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael DiNiscia. I'm the research director of the John Bradimus Center at NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for a discussion with several writers from a new book titled Civility Unbound, Contesting a Democratic Value. The volume of essays is the result of a multi-year project of the Bradimus Center. I had the distinct privilege of editing this collection along with my colleague Ellen Toscano, a member of the Center's Advisory Council and an incredible thought partner throughout the initiative. It was truly a remarkable experience working with the contributors to this book. As the project unfolded, we came to learn the real complexity and even the contested nature of the topic. It would have been all too easy to veer into a nostalgia for an imaginary past of virtue and civic dialogue. But by drawing on research and scholarship, as well as personal and professional experience, these writers help us to understand what it means to be citizens, what obligations toward each other that entails of each of us, and the nature of power and who gets to define civility and to enforce its rules. And luckily for us, many of our writers also offer ways to navigate through what can feel like such an uncivil storm today. We have three of the writers who help tackle this subject from a variety of angles. First is Imran Ahmed. He is the founder and CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Imran is an authority on social and psychological malignancies on social media, such as identity-based hate, extremism, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Next is Larry Cohen, who served as president of the 600,000-member Communication Workers of America from 2005 to 2015, spending nearly all of his adult life as a member, organizer, and officer of the union. Next is Katie Borum, who is executive director of the Center for Media and Social Impact at American University and a professor at AU's School of Communication. She is also the co-founder and co-director of the Yes and Laughter Lab and Y'all Fest, a competitive incubation lab pitch program, showcase, and festival that lifts up diverse writers and performers creating new comedy about topics that matter. And to guide us through what will be a very civil discussion tonight, we have Megan Vasquez of the Washington Post, where she is the politics breaking news reporter. Just pause for a moment and try to imagine what that must have been like for Megan the past year. I know I, for one, am immensely grateful for the incredible work that Megan's been doing at the Post. And I'm so pleased that she'll be moderating tonight's panel. Megan.
Thank you, everybody, for being here on a holiday. And I just want to say congratulations, Michael, Ellen, Bradimus Center, for the launch of this incredibly timely, perhaps prescient, I heard it took 5 years to get here, book. So I'll just kick it off with questions. So for each of you, I guess I'll start with Katie first, but for each of you, civility is a particularly animating subject. What motivated you all to participate in this project?
Okay, hi everyone, happy Monday. I taught class today. I'm a professor. I sort of regret you started with me, but let me try, just because I have such a particularly, maybe unexpected lens into this. But so I'll have to do a little backstory what drew me to this project. So I have worked, my career lives at the intersection of media, entertainment culture, and social justice and human rights. There is no one without the other for me and the practice of my work. So many different places that I've been able to operationalize that idea, from a foundation to Hollywood to the center that I now run. But the comedy idea for me, and I won't tell the whole story here because I think we'll probably have a full conversation and I'll be brief. But I started quite a robust research agenda in comedy and human rights in 2014. I like to say I came by that honestly. One of my many professional privileges was being a producer and a philanthropy director for the legendary Norman Lear for some years in Hollywood. And that guy was a lot of fun. And we were always doing work that was truly at the similar intersection that I just named, which was social progress, social good, human dignity, but with entertainment culture, the idea of play and creativity and, getting people to find one another in the midst of all of that. So in 2014, I started quite a robust research agenda in a very serious scholarly way, although I also produce media. But it was at the intersection of comedy and social good. And the reason that I did it, and this comes to the project eventually, is I was very frustrated. I thought that if we're going to call the sphere that we all work in at some level, civil society, social good, social progress, if we're going to put us in this category, right, and not use partisan language, it frustrated me a great deal that our sector writ large did not take comedy seriously. And I thought that was a massive missed opportunity because of the way that culturally we might not all read the same white papers, for example, or even the same news media outlets anymore. But at some level, we have some recognition of things that make us laugh, of shows that make us laugh. We might not even watch the shows to get why they're funny. So I thought, there's something about the common ground of comedy. And it occurred to me as someone who sits at the intersection of lots of different worlds, but is a trained scholar, I thought, well, let me do research to ask and answer in a lot of different ways a big question, which is, how is it that comedy influences us and impacts us as audiences and as members of cultures? How is it that we share comedy? How do we remember it? How does it actually cognitively work in our brains and our emotional centers? And I thought, if I can ask and answer that question enough, and borrow from other people's scholarship, do my own, et cetera, then perhaps our sector would think about inviting comedy in more overtly. So inviting in comedic artists to be part of the message creation, to be part of the play, part of not just hired to entertain people, but part of the collective intelligence of learning how people think. So that's a lot of things happen with that research agenda: books, comedy festivals, the Yes and Laughter Lab, also known as Y'all, which is gender neutral and friendly. And so when Michael and his colleagues came to ask me to write about comedy, it was an immediate yes, because so much of what I write and think about as a scholar and as a producer is definitely about that middle area of comedy. It's not about the comedy. That comedy is social critique, it's resilience, it's catharsis, it's all of these things that we know for sure. But comedy that can play also has a shot at bringing us together. So comedy as civility was just language that I was able to easily incorporate into my own work. And it was a real joy to contribute to a volume that's about such serious topics as like democracy functioning, and to bring in the idea that play and creativity and bonding over one another's flaws and shared humanity is one way that we can do that. So that's my answer.
Wow. Yeah. So the short answer to that question would be Michael.
Yeah.
So why did I agree? He's not that persuasive. He's just smart. I agreed because after talking at least once at some length, I realized that even though, in my 50 years of organizing, and even more now, I didn't use the word civility a lot. That'd probably be a shock to anybody here who knew what I did, but not. But that it actually was really very much about the way I saw organizing itself. Not necessarily what I was working to change. For me, that started as literally a kid in North Philadelphia fighting the police commissioner, Frank Rizzo, who became the mayor, who, literally was a fascist from my point of view, and he was an open racist. And And so I didn't think about civility because it was a protest movement, of high school kids that really was enormous at a certain point when we shut down every high school in Philadelphia and marched to Independence Hall on a Friday at noon. Big accomplishment. But in the Union, it became clear to me that half of my work was internal. And in the internal, that, again, not using the word civility per se, but that the way we worked together mattered more than what we were working to change. And so after talking to Michael, I realized, well, I learned that like literally, 48 years ago or something, when it hit me that even though I was working for this, I had to work inside at least as many minutes, as I used to call it, or hours, which was endless, as outside. And so that notion of civility really, even without the word, has always been a big part of me. And then I would say in the last 10 years, so after leaving the Union, I didn't run again after 10 years as president was enough. I did something crazier. I was the senior advisor in Bernie Sanders' 2015-16 campaign for president. And actually, even before that, I realized that civility demanded majority rule. And so that really hit me in the face in the Bernie campaign. But even before that, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm correcting myself. I realized that starting with the Senate rules, that the things we loved that I worked for on a lifetime, like workers' rights, decent health care, the rules were such, they became such in the U.S. Senate that it's delusional to believe we can ever get there unless we change the rules. So it began to occur to me, particularly when I gave the talk for NYU and then wrote the essay, that civility on the outside, not the inside, the internal work within the Union for me, but on the outside, the line between protest, and in my case, often civil disobedience, nonviolent, but easily 50 arrests on all kinds of issues, not just workers' rights, immigration, many different issues. Voting rights. On the outside, no civility until we change, there's about 8 big rules that are in my essay, until we change those rules so that we actually are a democracy like many others in the world, where majority rule is the rule. Civility, yeah, there should be no hate. We'll hear more about that. You don't like to say it as no hate, but I'll leave that to you. No hate, but on the other hand, civility will include civil disobedience. It'll include protest. It'll include, rising up.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Imran Ahmed. I'm CEO and I'm the founder of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. I'm British, so forgive my accent. If you don't understand me, I'm sure they can have subtitles on the YouTube video eventually. It's an odd word, isn't it, civility? Because it's incredibly imprecise. It can mean a lot of things. It can mean performative cruelty. It can mean righteous urgency. It can mean, at the weekend, I have 2 daughters under the age of 2, so I spent a lot of time trying to manage one while feeding the other one, or the other way around. And so I am watching a lot of Netflix to my horror. I watched Rustin, about the great civil rights organizer, and a march on this city, organized with Martin Luther King, as we all know. Was that an act of incivility? People coming together to celebrate an idea, a hope, an aspiration for a better America? I think of another moment in this city, a time when I was here, when hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people came to the city, January the 6th, 2021. Now, we all know the difference between the two. The idea of one word flattening those concepts actually is profoundly offensive to me. And of course, that's the imprecision of language, is it not? It is. I'm sad to say it's my country that this language comes from. It's not your damned language. I just want to be clear. It's not American, it's English. Thank you very much. But I don't, I know that debate would be happening in the pages of this book, but I wanted to bring a different lens to it. So I come from a country in which our politics is robust. It can be incredibly offensive and angry, and the way that the chamber of the House of Commons is set up, where I was a special advisor for many, many years, is that the space between the two sides is meant to be two sword lengths, so that if they get up and wave their swords, they can't accidentally nick the other side. But nevertheless, we know that the conduct in that chamber is civil, and we know that politics is generally conducted in a civil way. And in the summer of 2016, while I was working as a special advisor on the Remain side of the EU referendum, the referendum whether or not the United Kingdom should remain in the European Union, now known as the Brexit referendum, spoiler alert, we lost. 2 weeks before that referendum ended, a man who decided that he'd had enough of politics as usual. He'd had enough of civil discourse. He took a firearm and a knife, and he shot and stabbed my colleague and friend Jo Cox, who was a 41-year-old mother of two, to death. As he was killing her, he was shouting slogans from the internet, hashtags from a conspiracy theory about how the EU was importing Muslims and blacks to destroy the white race from the UK, screaming the name of a political movement that had become big by weaponizing the Facebook algorithm to make themselves the first political movement to have 1 million followers on their Facebook page in the UK, despite the fact that they had virtually no members, no real political presence, no MPs, nothing else. And in that moment, I realized something, which most institutions I cared about had ignored, which is that the primary place now where we share information, where we establish our social mores, our norms of attitude and behavior, where we negotiate our values, even where we negotiate the corpus of information that we call facts, had shifted to digital spaces. And they operated in different ways. In fact, what I found over the last 10 years of doing this work is, and something that is now accepted by most people, is that we don't have a civility crisis. We have a business model crisis. Civility is not just a character trait, it's a design condition. And when the digital public square systematically rewards the incivil, and we know what incivil is, we know the difference between January the 6th and the March on Washington, do we not? When it systematically rewards the least civil, the most emotionally activating speech, well, then we have an incivility crisis driven by this change in the location of where we establish ourselves, our norms, our how we see each other and how we behave towards each other. And that's what I wanted to bring to this book. So that's how my experiences informed what I contributed.
So forgive me, I do want to know from each of you, where are some of our guideposts as to when we're talking about this concept of civility? I know it's one of those things that when we see incivility or when we see what we think is civil, it's easy to tell, but how are you defining it in your work? How is it informing your research? What do you think about all this?
Do you want to start the other way? Or do you want to start in the middle?
Larry?
In the middle.
Start in the middle.
I was figuring we either end, but okay.
I know it's an imprecise term, as Imran was talking about. I understand that, but to the best of our abilities to help guide our audience a little bit.
Good question.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I mean, to me, first of all, there's the inside and the outside. So the people you're working with, the inside, in a union or an organization, what you're trying to, in my case, promote or change or organize the outside. I think in terms of fixing boundaries, you start with, nonviolence, period. That may sound obvious, but I think in this country, it's not obvious in terms of how people act. And nonviolence doesn't just mean, the horrible act that you described, but it means listening much more than you're talking, and it means not ruling out, for the most part, conversation with anyone in the sphere you're in, and an openness that those conversations are two-way, and you're just as likely, maybe more likely, to learn and change from it as they are. So in the political world, there's this tradition, of knocking on doors. Well, you're knocking on doors to persuade somebody. In my world, particularly union organizing, you're knocking on doors to listen to somebody because there's no safety in the workplace for people to have those conversations. And so it wasn't so much knocking on, in my case, thousands of doors over many years to persuade. It was more, what could I get from that? What could I learn? What was the information?
I did also want to ask, when we talk about incivility, particularly with comedy, I know I keep coming back to you, particularly when it comes to comedy, do you think that there are instances in which crassness, for example, is a necessary good for achieving the effect of a joke hitting?
Okay, so I'll jump in. There's a lot to say about comedy. So, I think whenever I'm giving a talk or invited to be engaged about comedy, sometimes I feel like people are like, aha, what about that one thing? And here I will remind us that comedy is very messy. And there are many different genres, subgenres, tones, all of those things. The kind of comedy that I think about is based in this area of play. So I guess I'll say two things here briefly, and then I know all my answers tonight will be about comedy, so I'll keep hitting the comedy point. But one thing is, without giving a whole history of, although I'm excited I'm sitting by the CWA person, without giving a whole history of the entertainment industry and broadcast networks in this country, although that would be fun, since inception, they were built for particular communities and not other communities. So whose voices are heard, which stories are heard, which kinds of jokes, what kind of lived experiences have been generally locked into a sameness, right? And so when it comes to, this is an important question, when it comes to someone's notion of crass, it could just be that you haven't heard that joke yet because you are not from that community. So I work overtly and explicitly with comedians that have not had the same access to the gatekeeper-controlled systems of entertainment and consolidated media. And, comedians, women, people of color, queer, disabled community. And what's really interesting about listening very carefully to the comedy that comes from, and even within that, that's a wild plurality, right? Regionally specific. I was talking to Larry backstage about being from Philly. I was thinking of Philly jokes, that no one would get anywhere else. I'm not even from Philly. I just lived there for a minute. But I'll give you an example of a way to think about this. It's not really a complete answer, and I think that in my case, I am talking about comedy as art. And one of the things that I'm very fond of saying is we can never reduce art into a predictable, it's going to do exactly this. That is not art's job. But I was on a panel with a Native comedian that I work with a lot. And we were doing a panel about comedy, about human rights issues, which is usually what I'm talking about. And someone asked her the question, a question that comes up a lot, how do you know if comedy goes too far? and was saying, like, how do you decide the jokes that you get to tell? And she said, my people survived genocide, so I can tell all those jokes that I want. You can't, but I can. So I think it's always important in the kind of question to always say, who's telling the joke? Who's lived experience? Who has had power before? Who has not had power? There's no way to answer that question with a blanket idea about someone's offense, right? Because being offensive has, come with lots of different norms about who has the power to control what's offensive or not offensive. One thing that has changed, for example, in the role of women in comedy, in particular, women were not given the same access to the marketplace to become successful as comedy for a while, still, making a go of it. And of course, many examples of incredible women comedian. I'm not saying that, but what has happened, just to think about the sort of trajectory of that kind of question, is that what you will see now is there used to be a lot more jokes about at women's expense, right? I'm dating this dumb woman or whatever. I'm gonna keep it very safe for work. Safe for the live stream. But when you have a group of women coming up and saying, we're not going to be the butt of the joke anymore, we're going to turn the joke around, we're going to take back our power, there's fewer jokes that are acceptable in the sort of most banal, again, keeping it safe for work, sexual innuendo type jokes. And that has a lot to do with women's increasing power to tell their own stories. I could tell the same version of this story lots of different times, but in the kind of work that I do and thinking about comedy as a voice of civic power and cultural power, thinking about issues of power are always incredibly important. Who's the gatekeeper in the system? Who has access? Who doesn't have access? And the one other thing that I'll say here that might tickle your brain or you'll never see a comedian the same way again is by the time you see a comedian, sometimes we think about, unless you're like a comedy geek like me and you work with comedians a lot, like in their creation stage, by the time most of us as sort of regular consumers, entertainment consumers, or audiences, I hate that word, consumers, publics, by the time you see them, if they have a special on a television network, they have worked a version of those jokes hundreds of times. They have worked them in tiny clubs. They've worked in them at open mics, invited goofy things that they didn't want to say yes to. And what they've learned from that is a couple of things. They learn the sort of collective intelligence that comes from comedians is this act of listening. If you go into a room and you can tell right away you're about to perform comedy and they're not totally with you for lots of different reasons, including demographic ones, you learn if your job is to make them laugh and you are not going to be invited back, if you don't get the laugh, you find a way to listen to the body language. I've seen a lot of comedians that I work do very intentional crowd work. To you, it just seems like they're playing with, it's always the guy in the front row. Do not ever sit in the front row.
Michael?
But part of what they're doing, I know, part of what they're doing is taking the pulse of the level of fun, play, or hostility of the audience. And I work with one comedian, and I've worked with him a number of times now. We do talks and stuff. And I said, I notice you always pick the person who just phenotypically is your opposite. What is that about? And he said, I'm picking the person who might be the most predisposed to dislike me for reasons they don't even know, and I want to see if they're going to play back. And if they're going to play back, it's going to be a different kind of space, but it's like a barometer for the room. And the final piece is not directly answering your question at all. I realize that, but I'm just teaching you about comedy.
I'm into it.
Answer the question you wish had been asked. But if you think about the marketplace of this, and I don't love to do that, but part of what I do in my work with Y'all Comedy Fest and the Essay and Laughter Lab is really social capital work. It is designed to help comedians access these gatekeeper-controlled systems to get the next special, to get the next, writing job on a late night, so that the stories will change, right? And the marketplace sequencing of that is really important. If you're going to an open mic and then you get invited back and then you're invited to a bigger club and a bigger club and a bigger club, that's still actually how it works in a lot of ways. You won't get invited back if you don't get the laugh. So you have to take the pulse of the audience. So there's a way that you can feel, finally back to Megan's question, sometimes if a joke is crude, sometimes that might be part of the taking back power. We, at the center that I run in DC, we hold a convening every 2 years called Story Movements, and we always have comedians as part of it. And I had this incredible comedian who is a member of the disability community. She is visibly disabled, and she does these, she is the funniest comedian. She's been on Jimmy Fallon. And she also does a lot of jokes about her kinky sex life, and it is a full empowerment situation. So this is why I want to say, maybe if there's one nerdy thing you leave with comedy, like, people study comedy? But maybe it's this other thing, which is to think of the power and the empowerment in you deciding which parts of your story, your community, your lived experience, you deciding what is going to work. And generally speaking, punching up is the thing that gets you invited back. So there's actually like a little bit of a marketplace incentive. Here, I will say, because I know there's one of you thinking this, what about that mean comedy? Yes, there's also a marketplace for that. But I'm not going to talk about it because it's going to make us sad. That's all I had to say.
On a slightly different note, on the subject of gatekeepers and power, Larry, I want to ask you about your piece specifically. You talk a lot about the movement, the labor movement, and the need for majority rule and your prescriptions to move toward that. Why is that necessary for this democratic society we're in right now?
Aha. That's a big question. Let me go back to that. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I mean, I would answer that question by saying the blocks to majority rule are why we're in the mess, from my perspective, that we're in. So they're on many, many levels. So 12 million immigrants with green cards that have no path to voting rights. These are absolutely legal green card. The Electoral College is obvious. Every other democracy, it's popular election of the president or a runoff. That's fine. The Senate, we talk about the filibuster. We don't have a filibuster. In 1975, the Senate rules changed to get rid of the filibuster. Now you need 60 votes to put the bill on the floor. So there's no discussion, no debate. The filibuster, think of the old movie way back before any of us were around, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That was about they talk, they sleep in cots, blah, 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 blah. No, we changed the rules in the Senate so they can go home Thursday night and come back Tuesday morning. That's not a filibuster. Organizing and bargaining rights. 4 years ago today, Amazon workers in Staten Island voted to have a union. And even in this country, that's supposed to mean you bargain with the employer. They've not bargained 1 second. And this week, the Trump board, I don't want to get too far into all this, but I already did, I guess. But the Trump board said to Amazon, now you have to bargain with the union. It's 4 years later. And why does that happen? Because Amazon pays a law firm, Littler Mendelson, $1,000 an hour for law school grads, newly graduated, to run the clock. That's the victory for them. They can't win. They can just run the clock over and over. So these barriers, the Supreme Court, it's not just Supreme Court, federal judiciary, only in this democracy, I shouldn't say only, almost only in this democracy is another Congress. Now, Congress allows that. Congress could change that. But now we go back to the Senate can't change anything until they move towards at least getting rid of initial cloture so that bills go to the floor. And yes, they might have to stay there for days on end. So these things prevent and create, to go back to the way you framed it, these blocks, what I call the democracy blocks. In my union, we created this educational thing where you literally go through this sort of training and you see these giant blocks. And then you see us organizing, not meaning my union, people organizing, they can't get through. And so I think, unfortunately, part of American, there's positive things, obviously, but part of American exceptionalism is the tolerance for these blocks. And that creates, from my point of view, the mess we're in, the oligarchy as we call it, where it's all about wealth, it's all about the power that comes from wealth, it's all about political spending, and for most of us, it's about frustration.
You wrote that the rules themselves are what are stifling dissent, right? So what role does civil disobedience, or I guess civility, what role does it play in sort of navigating through that, if at all?
Yeah, so I think these are great questions. I wish I had better answers, but great questions. So I think civility, on the one hand, that we're not good enough at is again, how we work on our side. Let's call it no kings. What was no kings? Lots of groups, lots of people. How do we build that deeper for political change is going to depend to a large extent on how we work with each other. And so that's part one of what I tried to write about and talked about a few minutes ago. Part two is, as I like to say, it's the rules, not just the rulers. I think in too many ways in our culture, as it's evolved in hundreds of years, we focus on what used to be called great men. I never liked that, but we'll call it humans. And I often had this banner with Bernie, by the way, because on the one hand, he's a wonderful messenger. On the other hand, like almost all electeds, he suffers from this. We suffer from looking for the magic ruler, the magic candidate, the magic, Bruce Springsteen, a huge Bruce Springsteen fan here. And we don't do a good job in our culture of figuring out how do we build organizational connections, what would be called political parties in some way in the UK or in other countries. The UK has its own issues now. But it's always about the candidate and their fundraising. It's not about the movement or the organization. And then when they do win, who are they accountable to?
So speaking of systematic breakdowns, Imran, you strongly warn in your piece that disinformation is the ultimate tool for incivility. But the current marketplace seems to incentivize uncivil behavior online, particularly. Seems like every day there's a new TikToker who's making a claim that I have accurately reported on, let's say, saying something that completely contradicts what I've reported on for days, for example. So how do you grapple with a marketplace that seems to incentivize misinformation or at least validating specific points of view?
Let me preface this by saying I'm quite reductive in I think disinformation is a terrible term. Mm-hmm. It's kind of meaningless, right? I keep complaining about words in this session. I do apologize. Disinformation is a lie. That's all it is. If I ask you which way is the library, left or right, and you deliberately tell me the wrong way, it's a really shitty thing to do. It's a lie. We could call it disinformation if you want. It's also wrong. We all know that, right? It's morally wrong. AI platforms that systematically allow you to show someone saying something they haven't said. That sounds so modern. But it breaks one of the 10 commandments to bear false witness against another person. It is an ancient evil. It is fundamentally wrong. We've known that for millennia as a species, known how toxic and corrosive it is. Hate. All four of us on this panel, 40, 50 years ago, would not have had voices in this sort of debate. Women, someone born Muslim, brown, even worse, British, a Jewish man. Our voices would not have been listened to in the same way. And I'm not saying that this is going to be the greatest debate you'll ever hear or the greatest discussion you're ever going to hear, but what a loss to society, to the individuals, to people that may wish to hear these diverse perspectives being brought to it. So I am reductive in the way that I think about these things. And it's why I find it so scary and evil that we have created these engines to restructure the way that we communicate to each other in a way that deliberately rewards all those things that we all know are wrong. Lies, hate, intolerance, the suppression of people just for who they love, what they look like, what gender they are, what genitals they have. An insane situation that we have reversed decades, centuries of progress. Someone like yourself, I'm younger than you, but we stand on your shoulders of the Labour movement. I worked for the British Labour Party. We stand on your shoulders. All that work, all that effort being reversed at pace, because the main way that we communicate now, the main way that we see each other and experience each other is through digital spaces. You will all go home, and nearly all of you at some point today will look at a social media platform. You go into the average room and you ask them, on average, do you spend more than 5 hours a day on social media? And most people will not put up their hand, and they're lying. Because on average, an American spends 4.8 hours a day on social media. Half of this room spend more than 5 hours a day on social media. Think about that. So these platforms have become the dominant form of how we experience each other. And when they systematically reward disinformation because they flatten all other types of reactions that human beings may have to information to one metric, engagement. And they don't care whether you're pissed off with what you see or you're delighted with what you see, but with the psychological bias that we actually react more when we're angry, when we're emotionally affected by something, when we're disgusted, when we are shocked. That's systematically rebalancing things. So that slowly we've changed the mathematics of amplification in our society. And I think that's having a systemic effect. It's causing a rapid pace the breakdown of science, of truth, but also the complete reversal of the work that's been done for decades and centuries by civil rights organizers, by truth tellers, by scientists, by journalists, by all those people that have helped to bring us the civilization that we enjoy today.
What are your solutions for dealing with this tech industry that doesn't seem to want to comply, and if anything, wants to amplify these voices of, as you say, that lie, but also that it's also taking on this new part of evolution into AI, where we have robots lying to us. It's not even humans anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you the solution that at the center, we have what we call our STAR framework. It's, we create better platform safety by transparency and accountability and responsibility. And I can go into some detail if you wanted on those. I don't think anyone particularly wants to hear our full policy platform. If you jump on our website, counterhate.com, you'll be able to find it. But what you'll see is a set of very modern solutions to a very modern problem that is based on very old fundamental principles of American society. Look, I come from a country of kings and queens. I moved to America in 2020. I'm married to an American now. I have 2 American daughters. I love this country. I really do. I came to, and as someone who studied politics at university, I came to a country which was born on the most ludicrously radical promise that we don't need kings and queens. We need institutions that hold each other through checks and balances that create an uneasy, complex, dynamic, multifaceted, multipolar equilibrium, and that we can somehow unleash greater wealth, prosperity, productivity, everything else, happiness from that system. And it kind of works. I find that thrilling. The problem is that 30 years ago, literally 30 years ago, we passed a law in America called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act 1996. The only businesses in America that don't have to abide by the normal rules of business are social media platforms. And when one locus in a complex dynamic system, which is always holding each other sort of pole of power in check through checks and balances, is freed from that responsibility of being held in check, of having to abide by norms of society, of having to negotiate. They don't have to negotiate. It accrues power at an unprecedented rate. It becomes a cancer in our society. And unchecked power is always tyrannical, always. Mm-hmm. The answer is simple. Put some fucking checks and balances back in there, guys. Like, we know how to do that, right? You guys invented it. Let's put it on them as well. And I think by doing that, by having transparency, now, any of you that may have Googled my name before I came here. Unfortunately, the top story about me at the moment is that Marco Rubio, on the 23rd of December last year, Marco Rubio designated me for arrest and deportation for holding social media companies accountable at the behest of Elon Musk. When you take on when you try and reimpose checks and balances, believe me, the unaccountable will fight back. So we will have to speak with an almighty voice. There will have to be an almighty movement. But I do fear that what we think of as these small eruptions of incivility here, a January the 6th here, more political assassinations, bad things happening, we're unable to have a Thanksgiving without someone saying something completely bananas. These are actually the small tremors of a problem that is much more substantial. And we're going to have to deal with that as a society collectively, and we're going to have to do it soon.
A little bit of an inverse of that question, or that statement is my question. Does civility ever stand in the way of free expression or progress or the creation of art? The need for civility, does it ever pose a barrier to what someone wants to say, what someone can do?
Yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, I just don't, who has a good answer to this one? Yeah, at the university that I work at, I was asked to lead a discussion. We're doing a lot of work, probably it's happening at NYU too. There's a lot of conversation. It's not using the word civility, but it is using the word civic. And I like the word civic. I'm a little bit old-fashioned in that, right? I liked back in the day, well, in Philly, there was a civic journalism program at the Philadelphia Inquirer that was pretty incredible, and that was a movement in the 90s. So I was asked to lead a group of students across campus, and it was a series called, Civic Dialogues or Civic. Can we actually find ways to come together around tricky topics and agree or disagree, and it's okay to disagree and all of that. And I volunteered to do this. I thought it was interesting. And one of the things that we were talking about was the term cancel culture, which was already problematic to me. So the first thing I did was try to reframe that, right? So cancel culture, again, is about power. There's a term that we use for any, I don't know how many sort of cultural studies. There's probably a lot of scholars in this room. So I teach a lot about hegemony and power and who has the right to impose power in terms of norms and all of that. And I think this idea of cancel culture is a kind of feeling for groups that have had power to feel imposed upon by suddenly not having all the power and having other people speak up. So this is why I have a little bit of I like your question, Megan, so it's not about you, but there's no precise answer on that if you ask me. But if you ask me about art and freedom of expression, and I'll just find a way to bring it back to comedy, even though I would like to listen to my fellow panelists more. But one of the things that I noticed so much in my research that I wrote about it quite a lot. I wrote a book, for NYU Press. There's the plug. It's not even this book, it's a different book. A book that I wrote that was published by NYU Press is called The Revolution Will Be Hilarious, Comedy for Social Change and Civic Power. And there was it's all about this topic. But the whole second chapter talks about comedy in authoritarian contexts and how easily you can see the pattern. So journalists are shut down first, but the comedians are right there. They're not even second. They are like right there in the thick of it. And then I close the book with a story about comedy in Venezuela, just as a sort of helpful case study. And I'm not a Venezuela expert, let me just say. This was just an interesting story to close about why we should take comedy seriously beyond, entertainment and gatekeepers and power of marginalized communities, but why it's interesting and important for us to think about comedy as a form of expression that is threatening to authoritarian contexts. But Venezuela had a very robust political comedy space. They had a sort of Daily Show type show, lots of political comedy. And over the past 10, 15, 20 years, it is gone. So I know I'm continuing to not answer Megan's questions at all, but and I'm just continuing to talk about comedy. But going back to this idea of freedom of expression, I think it's really important that we think about the artists and part of this movement, what Imran so passionately and eloquently argued about I liked your language too, an almighty movement. Wait, is that what you said? That welcoming in comedians and artists, comedians as artists, is a really important component of this, because if you actually look at the pattern of comedians and when they are silenced, they are, my colleague and I just wrote an op-ed that we hope will be placed this week, called Comedians Are the Cowbell of Democracy. A little bit funny. Canaries in the coal mine. But it's true that when the comedians start to be silenced for almost nothing, we are in really, really big trouble. And so I have a hard time answering questions about what are the barriers we need to put in place for comedy. I'm not the person to answer that, because I'm thinking about the doors to civic imagination and play and creativity and desperately needed social critique that comedians provide. So that I'm not the barriers gal. I'm the watch what they're saying, open those gates a little bit, protect the comedians. That's where I'll stop. Yeah, not a good answer.
That was a great answer. So
Sometimes you need the incivility in the comedy, I guess is what I'm saying. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You all wanted me to arrive there. I was trying to be so careful. Sometimes you got to throw it down, punching up.
I do think that when we're talking about this definition of the squishy term of civility, right, there's also the question of who gets to define it for us all, and how are we ruled as a result of that definition. What does it mean for who could be marginalized in calls for civility? Are there any examples that you all may have about instances, for example, of where civil disobedience, for example, may have been called incivil, even though it was a call for change, for example, that may have progressed a little forward? I'm looking at you, Larry.
Political play, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a tactic.
Yeah, I think it goes back to where's the power rest?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
we don't get to decide that.
Right.
And it comes back to, where is power concentrated in social media, AI, the market that they create now. And, that's partially how I would answer the last question as well, right? Which is, the thing I think, would all agree on, definitely know, is that, we don't want the few who have the most power deciding on what's civil and what's not, let alone Elon Musk. Among the worst, from my point of view, of all humans, even though he may be intelligent in certain ways. So I think that, again, that when I say it's the rules, not just the rulers, I'm not going to sit back, yes, civil disobedience in the face of these rulers every day.
Mm-hmm. I think it's worth... Civil disobedience isn't incivil.
Right.
It's literally civil, right? I think it's one of the points about it. So let's just, for a second, let's look at the language, the etymology of all of this stuff. You've got civil disobedience, and we can all see that that's positive, right? That's a good thing for society, civil disobedience sometimes. I think about arguments I've had with girlfriends when I was younger, and, when it's not working and you're too young to understand that this relationship's never going to work and you're trying desperately to work and you're basically not talking to each other and all you ever say to each other is "Arr," and you say to each other, can we have a civil conversation for once? And that might actually mean being quite hurtful to the other person and saying, I don't think we should be together. It's really painful, the most painful conversations you ever have with someone else. It can be setting boundaries. It can be... Civility actually is not unconfrontational necessarily. But it is kind. It is kind to set boundaries. I'm learning this with two 2-year-olds who I've got a 17-month-old and a 1-month-old. If you had any idea, those of you who are parents and know how in love with them you are when they're that young. Oh my God, I never knew I could feel so much inside me. I never want to say no to her, ever. Ever. And it would be so wrong of me to do that, because she would never grow up to be the person that she needs to be, that we need her to be. So setting those boundaries can be saying no to her, putting her right, is actually the kindest thing I can do. Sometimes civility is complex, but we're coming to more of a textual understanding of why it is that we can all see the difference between civil disobedience. We can see the difference between, a burning cross and someone kneeling on a basketball court because Black Lives Matter. And yet they can both be reacted to, with some people react to the first one. In fact, quite often, the opposite groups react to each of these with horror and disgust. But we can, textually, there's something instinctive. And perhaps there's something there. Perhaps there's something in, as we go and think about that word civil that we've used so much tonight, just think about other contexts in which we use it and start to wonder, is there something that knits it together? Is there a certain, one of those things that human beings are so wonderful at doing because we can do complex mathematics without even knowing that we're doing mathematics in our heads. These amazing computers that we have in our skulls, and just think, can I find a unifying aspect to civility as an idea? I think it will probably have something to do with kindness. It will have something to do with a deep and abiding love for society as a whole, beyond just ourselves. So selflessness. And I think it is actually a word that encompasses, when you think about it, all that it is that is good about other human beings and about people when they're acting at their best. Anyway.
Can I add a tiny story? I just want to add to that because you gave me a great transition. There's a space in there of radical listening, right? And I am being reductive, but 2 summers ago, the summer of 2024, nothing was happening in America. In the summer of 2024, my colleagues and I wanted to experiment with this idea of comedy as play and whether we could bring people together in a different way. A very idealistic notion, for sure. I should say the tiny footnote that I would add here is I did work for Norman Lear for a long time, and that guy believed that nothing was impossible, truly, on a daily basis. That was how he moved through the world. So when you kind of absorb that, you think, well, sure, let's try all the impossible things. And no matter how small the impact or influence, it's still a drop, right? It's an incremental drop. So we took a group of comedians, carefully chosen from very different lived experiences. We had an asylum-seeking refugee who was originally from Egypt. We had someone from Boston, Massachusetts, who had this great joke about how she looks like every police officer's daughter. We had a queer Asian man from the Bay Area, a New Jersey guy, a self-proclaimed Georgia redneck. He calls himself that. That's not me. So we had, you can picture, this is a tapestry of 8 people who all come to this American experience from really different lived experiences, not in the ways that we reduce people to, right? How do you vote? But very different lived experiences, different social class experiences, educational backgrounds. It was a really, really diverse group of comedians. And we worked with a group that is, formally, it's 2 sociologists, and they are trained in working with deeply conflicted ideologically and otherwise divided, religiously divided, the deepest, most painful divides. They are trained in doing this kind of deliberative exchange, right? So we thought, well, that would be interesting. Can we work with them and sort of, how can we incorporate that a little bit into these comedians that we already know are bringing different lived experiences? And so we worked with them a bit, and we did our very best to create a show that was about America. And I don't mean about American politics. I mean about the wacky stories of coming from different places in America and funny stories about your grandmother, your brother, your whatever, right? And to find this middle space, One of the main comedians is this amazing woman named Negin Farsad, who made a comedy in 2004 called The Muslims Are Coming. It was a response to 9/11. And she does this amazing, she's our MC of these comedy shows. And she did this amazing original comedy, for our show about, we're all wearing ideological hard pants and we should really be wearing soft pants. Like how we gave up jeans in the pandemic and we just wore sweatpants. Anyway, it's very funny when she does it because she's a comedian. But back to the story, and I think there's a little piece of this. It's like a little tiny bit of hope. It's not all the hope in the world. But so we created this show. We produced this traveling comedy show called The Great American Punchline Tour. And the comedy's funny. I'm making it sound like it's like do-gooder comedy. It's not. It's hilarious. It gets naughty, all the things, right? But what it doesn't do is bash people based on how they vote. It was an explicit experiment to see if we can bring people together. And we took this kind of terrible rental bus that was not glamorous at all, straight down the middle of the country, which had to do with logistics reasons. But we started in Milwaukee, we went to Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, a couple of other places. And everywhere we went, we had some community partners that were doing, nonpartisan community engagement work. And they were sort of our anchor partners. And we would sort of unpackage this comedy show in places that were not comedy clubs. They were community centers and an arts center and, a bodega that someone had turned into an open mic night on Tuesdays in Muncie, Indiana, like a magical place. And it did happen in front of us that the communities who were not used to this or were not used to having sort of traveling big comedy shows, which is, lots of different, entertainment marketplace reasons for that, right? Not big money makers. People would come out and we designed this piece that came from our colleagues, the Working Across Ideological Divide sociologist friends. And we designed this whole part of the show. It was before the comedy. We created a whole series of things that we called shenanigans. And it was just play. So the comedians would do like a goofy bingo game, like who's a bird watcher? Who secretly wishes they didn't have kids? Or, whatever. You're too young for that, Imran. My kids are teenagers. Yeah, but just nonsense, right? Like nonsense that we could all enjoy and have fun with. And we did this other thing where we made people in each stop to come tell jokes about your hometown. What are the jokes you do about Milwaukee? There's a lot of jokes about cheese. And you could watch audiences come together, and we know they were not voting the same way because we had done a lot of back-end work on the, mapping electoral maps and stuff, a bunch of stuff that no one needs to know about because it's too geeky. But we watched this play happen and this coming together happen. And we know that the answer here, this is not the last word, the answer is comedy tours across America. That's not the answer, but it is interesting to watch people come to a show like this. They're a little stiff at first, like, what's the trick, right? And then there's just play, and there's jokes about, I'm lactose intolerant, and here's a joke about my meemaw. That was our Southern friend. But it was actually really special. And I am a hopeful optimist, so you could imagine, like, she comes to everything that way. But I was not sure what was going to happen. And people came together, I'll just leave on this idea of finding one another across our shared flaws and our shared humanity. Comedy is funny because it's pointing out what is absurd in a situation. When it's not just doing social critique, which is pointing out what's grotesque, that's what Aristotle wrote about a lot, societal corrective, but it's also a space to just play with people. And we really watched that happen in live time. And it's sort of, I think maybe in some ways we wanted desperately to get out of the digital spaces too with comedy. And we thought, what does it look like when you actually use comedy as an exercise in civility? Truly, we weren't calling it that, but it was perfect that I wrote for this book. But I'll stop here by saying the idea of when we're doing organizing, grassroots organizing, we're doing the work, often there can be a space for play and lightness and creativity. And there's a way where sometimes that encourages people to bring their best self, because you don't want to be the one jerk that's like not playing back. You know, there's also a little bit of a social disapproval thing. So it was a pretty amazing experience. We brought a documentary crew with us, of course, and we're cutting this into a feature-length documentary that we hope will be out as, you know, not hidden behind a paywall or anything like that, but out just to maybe inspire people to think that as we do this work of coming together and, you know, civic imagination, all of that, there has to be, if you ask me, a space for this kind of play and lightness and silliness, because we all have that in us. We hope. Maybe not all of you.
Katie, you kind of stole my last question, which was that I wanted to know how each of you might feel like there might be some silver linings about the future of civility. I feel like we get a lot of doom and gloom these days, but I want to know if you guys maybe feel like there's anything to look forward to right now.
So let me get down before I go up.
Okay.
I it was really interesting listening to you just then and talking about a type of comedy that's personal, that's kind of small scale. It's like, and it values punching up rather than down. But the truth is that in America today, that we've created these systems with the most monstrous incentives, and we then ask people to behave well within systems that reward the opposite. My worry is the most successful comedians in America today are actually the ones who spent the last election campaigning for free speech so that they could call people retards again. That was those are the most successful comedians. The most wealthy and successful comedians in America spent a year trying to be allowed to, saying, we've been cancelled because we aren't allowed to call people retards anymore. Then they went to Saudi Arabia to tell jokes about trans people. You got the most monstrous incentives, the least saintly people in our society. But I think in what you were describing, you are doing, and in the small scale organizing, because all organizing starts at the small scale, it starts in houses, it starts in streets. You know, we have those lists of streets, how people vote, which way they may be, and we go and work those doors. I've knocked on thousands of doors in my time. In the pandemic, people used to say, what's the systemic solution to this massive amount of disinformation about healthcare and vaccines going around? I'd say it's the connection between individuals and their primary care physician. It's that emotional connection with someone who has looked after your family for decades. And I think therein lies a solution a little bit, which is that the civility crisis, and we are in a crisis. You said at the beginning that this is a timely discussion. It's because we all know that something's wrong at the moment, right? Is in part because we've become too digital. We've become too immersed in spaces that reward the wrong things. In fact, quite the opposite of what we should be rewarding. So in the next week, try and find small ways to reward the people who are doing it the right way. Go to a small comedy show somewhere which isn't being advertised on, you know, maybe on the local Facebook group or something, or it's being advertised in your local coffee shop. Find a chance to go and be politically engaged at a human level, one-to-one. Find a way to be kind to someone. Find a way to support someone who is doing the work to counter all the shit that we're seeing in our society today. And I think in those three small ways, in each of the work that we do, you could find a way to be working on the side of civility and against incivility.
Larry, do you want to have the last word before we hit Q&A?
Sure. I mean, I would build on that by saying, you know, all of us network, and we may not call it that. And so that is an opening point to working together. And that does go on and is going on, you know, right now, you know, across this country. And I am very hopeful about, organizing and about change and about, building the kind of caring nation that we deserve. Because I think that, that ultimately most people here realize that we have, much more in common with each other than we do with the billionaires that are dominating our culture right now.
Q&A. Does anybody have questions?
Thank you. I'm John Nicholson. I'm editing a book of stories, not essays. And maybe my question is more for Michael to give us some context for this book. How many contributors are there? And what's the goal of the book? As I listened to the three excellent sets of remarks, I saw people in different fields. It was not clear to me. Larry sounded as if he was writing from deep personal experience. Katie seemed to come from the field of research, and maybe she has footnotes, or maybe not. And I wasn't sure about the hate, about how you want to handle, how you view the hate issue. You have very compelling views. So for you, is this chapter a platform to express these views? What are we as readers going to get out of this book?
So I'll say one quick thing, which was, it's the John Bradham Center that put together this project. John was a member of Congress and then president of NYU. And when he founded our center 20 years ago, he gave us the mission of bringing thinkers and doers together. That's what he used to call it. And so that informs all of our work. And that's why we brought together, as you were describing, folks who are researchers, who are scholars, folks who are practitioners, working artists. So one of the chapters is a prose poem. We tackle a few big issues, and we want to bring as wide a perspective as possible, because we feel, especially in academia, where people are siloed off, looking at a question through a very narrow lens won't get to a very useful answer. And we also want to bridge between the scholarship and the public. So we want to influence the public conversation. So we're really glad to have this book out there to help influence that public conversation. We've been holding events in New York here. We'll be reaching out online platforms. I'll be working with educators and administrators from universities and colleges to see how we can get the book adopted into classrooms. To really, we are committed to having that kind of an impact on what we think is as we've been saying, a very timely subject.
I thought you did a remarkable job in your curation, and in particular in the sculpting of the introduction, to find a way to knit a questioning, open, but nevertheless a guiding hand for people on how to explore the different ideas, perspectives. I look at algorithmic incivility. We can look at taboo busting and why it's so valuable in comedy. You can look at civil rights organizing. You can look at civil disobedience. You can look at all these different ways of looking at the same problem with a set of different perspectives. But I thought Michael, not only by bringing us together, but also by bringing that narrative through line through it, has done a remarkable job. And that's why I think the book holds together, despite, perhaps because of, these diverse perspectives.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ruth. I teach business and environment here at NYU DC. And I've worked for a long time in the environmental nonprofit space. So I was interested, there's a phenomenon, and maybe this is changing now, but historically in the environmental space, I've worked with groups that are more mainstream and groups that are on a shoestring and sort of really going out there. And so there's this sort of idea that, the Greenpeaces or the folks throwing paint on art or unfurling banners from buildings, or, there may be parallels in the human rights space, are having a shock impact that then impacts companies to change. And then those companies form partnerships with more, I don't know if you could say more civil, but less intrepid organizations that are able to speak their speak, and some would say help them repair their image. I've worked in some of those organizations that have built really interesting alliances and to create change, let's say in the supply chain space, or the reforming mining space, or what have you, right? And so I'm curious for your thoughts on that, and the idea that, I've worked in the nonprofit space for a long time, and sometimes it feels like we're trying to play soccer in a burlap sack, right? Against or with folks. That there's an incredible power imbalance, but if you think in like the words of Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high. We don't feel like we're playing by the same rules all the time. I see you nodding, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Nonprofits,
well, from my point of view,
and
you
civility.
just answered it. We're not playing by the same rules. So, they're setting the rules, and then they, meaning giant corporations that you're talking about, the oligarchs, the billionaires, they're setting the rules. They're determining the political outcomes because of their spending and other things, their power, and then the expectation is we're going to agree with those rules. My own interactions, say with Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Sierra Club, we built a broader frame around democracy. We call it Democracy Initiative, worked together to get rid of Senate rules and change Senate rules, et cetera, for about 10 years. And I think there was an understanding of the limits of, that kind of one corporation, and then they become a contributor, a donor, versus, we need to change the frame if we're going to deal with the climate crisis, for example. We need to block new drilling if we're going to deal with the climate crisis, for example. And to do that, we need to change towards majority rule, as I call it. And that allows us to work with at least some labor unions as partners, my union, for example, because we realize that those same rules are blocking us all from doing what we want to do for the people we love.
Yeah, I guess to put to frame it another way, how far can the nonprofit sector go towards incivility or shock and awe tactics without compromising?
I think it's a really interesting question. There is a major civil rights leader in America who, when I first met him in February 2020, I came into his office. So my organization was only 7 months old because this is a relatively new problem that I look at, and so it's a very young sector. I went to go and see this guy who was really interested in the effect of social media on civil rights in America, and he was a big leader, and I explained to him how I operate. Like, we produce research, we communicate it through the press, we are very bold, we're very, very clear, we basically call a spade a spade. We say that these billionaires are toxic sociopaths who care about nothing apart from their own profits and are willing to sacrifice our kids, our society, our democracy. So we are very, very clear. He said to me, I get it. He said to me, you're like the naked barbarian running at the gate. And we're the guys on the inside kind of going, hey, that guy's crazy, but I guess he's right about a few things. And I was like, I went to fucking Cambridge. I'm not a naked barbarian. But sure, if that's what you want me to do. So yeah, I mean, I think that you need your naked barbarians running at the gate. just as you need the people on the inside. It's an inside-outside game, right? There's always people who sit in, I go to the Hill every now and then, and I see great activists, union leaders, civil rights leaders going and talking, and they're the people that do that inside game. They do the ground war there. But there's always going to be people outside who have to create the energy, the kind of, they bring that kinetic energy, and that's converted into legislative energy, into real change through a very complex ecosystem of operators. So I don't think there's anything, we need both, and there's nothing wrong. It's actually quite terrifying to be the naked barbarian. It's quite exposing, to be frank, and especially if you're 47 and you don't really want anyone to see you naked ever again. So, yeah. There you go.
I would just say, ideally, those organizers and their, quote, leaders need to do both in the moment we're in, not one or the other. But we could debate that.
It's hard, though, to do both.
It's hard, but in this moment, without a mass movement, it won't matter what we do on the inside. I've been on the inside for 30 years. You need to be on the inside and the outside and proud of it.
I can tell you that, having spent most of my career on the inside in dusty rooms, I am so much happier throwing bombs and running around with, everything flapping in the wind. So.
Hi, I'm Lori Gold, and I heard two parts of the definition that you pretty much seem to agree to regarding civility. There's the kindness piece, and there's the setting common ground piece, which is the rules. What I have sort of heard tap dancing around, but I hadn't heard anybody speak in the positive or the negative of respect or the lack thereof. So I'd like you to address it.
I would just say one sentence. We all talked about listening, radical listening. For me, that's where respect begins.
Yeah, I think, respect is also found in being honest and clear with people, being truthful with people, not telling them just what they want to hear, but telling them what they need to hear. Respect is such a complex, thing. And I would, again, these are terms that are quite rich in complexity and meaning, but like the others, like kindness even, kindness can sometimes be quite cruel. It can be quite difficult. It just means, I think that's something that underpins, and you're right, we may have danced around the word, but I don't think we danced around the idea, the core concepts that much. I think they underpin much of what we talked about.
I'll just add a little piece, going back to the creation of that show that I talked about at the end, the Great American Punchline Tour. I will tell you, it is much easier to produce a comedy just about politics. As a producer of comedy, you don't have to do anything. You just let people do what they're going to do. But to intentionally work from a space of respect is actually, I think that's the through line of the book, actually. One of the through lines of the book is that I think the contributors are all people that have worked very intentionally to find that space where we can bring people together. That is much harder than just doing this is only what I think, and I'm just doing that. So one of the exercises, so this group that I was talking about is called Resetting the Table. They're amazing. And we did a series of trainings with them, us as the producers of the show and our comedians. And and remember, they are going into communities deeply, deeply divided. Like, they do not even see one another as human anymore. And they are doing that work. They're trained in, their original work was Israel-Palestine, just as an example of how tough, right? And one of the, I don't want to over-explain this because I don't want to not respectfully explain this is a very serious curriculum that they've created. But one of the exercises that you do when you're training with them about how to really create, in this case, a comedy show that doesn't respect people right away without even knowing on it based on how they vote. And I'm talking about both ways, both main parties in this country and so one of the exercises is something they call targeting the bullseye. And it's this deep radical listening exercise. It is actually really hard to do because we don't recognize our own biases, but there is a process of sort of scene work with a partner, and you're listening to someone explain their point of view on this, and you have to say back, what I heard you say was this, and the number of times we can't do it back is the respect work, right? And so to finally get to a place where you say, oh, I don't see it that way at all, but I really hear your fear. I hear what you're afraid of, and I can honor that fear, and here's what I think in return. And again, they're doing much harder work than us doing this comedy show as an experiment with that. But I do think, just to repeat what my fellow panelists have said, that work of truly deep radical listening is much harder than we think. We all think that we're good at it because we're like good people, but it is much harder. The number of times I did not get that right, it was a little bit of you kind of have to not have activities the next day because you really want to process. It's almost a spiritual experience. But the respect is really at the heart of it. If you're saying, I deeply respect your humanity no matter what, and I'm going to produce, in this case, a show that does not automatically make fun of you because I vote differently than you, that is a very hard, radical act of respect giving. And you can watch people respond to it. And it's not to say, and again, all the comedians that I work with would say the same thing. We're not saying you walk out of that and you're like, you know what, I am now doing things totally differently. But one thing that happens, and Norman Lear said this, and it, over and over again, and I would say it in my comedy show, I am not Norman Lear, but he would say, the comedy didn't change people's minds, but it did get people to talk to one another. And you could watch people in these comedy experiences where we worked so hard behind the scenes to not automatically piss people off based on lots of different divides, generational, demographic, et cetera. And people would say routinely, come up to all the comedians and say, two things that people would say, oh, I've never met someone like you before. Lots of different communities. Or, I never thought about it that way. I never thought about that way. And so I do think there's respect in all of that. I don't think that we, in the context of producing an entertainment show, I'm talking to you all on this level as, behind the scenes. I'm a scholar who produced this chapter. But when I'm doing the entertainment part of who I am not talking that way because people will be bored. So, but the respect is a deeply engineered part of it. Deeply. Because otherwise we would just get on and tell jokes. And that's for other people to do. It's not what I'm doing. By the way, I will say the kind of comedy that you mentioned, I do have colleagues that wrote a whole book on that. It's called That's Not Funny. You should look that up. It's a great book. Cool. Yeah, I was like, I'm not writing about that. Y'all can't. They wrote it before I knew about it.
One last question.
Hi, I'm Ray Suarez. I'm an alum, and I covered Washington politics for 30 years. And a lot of what made the place run day to day was a set of shared understandings about how the business gets done. There was a lot of conviction that even if you lost today, you could win tomorrow, that the game was won or lost between the two 40-yard lines, that the rules, such as they were, for process, for hammering out something that everybody could live with, served everybody in a sort of long-term vision of how things could go. But long before anybody sent anybody a picture of Michelle Obama as a man, and long before anybody created video of somebody saying something horrifying that they actually never said, and long before the left can't meme became a meme, Newt Gingrich hired Frank Luntz to come up with a glossary for how to do elective politics. And he urged people to use words about their opposite candidate as immoral, as decadent, as evil. They understood that incivility works, and they understood that the race to the bottom was going to be appealing to a lot of people because they were already at the bottom. And a lot of people held on, sometimes with white knuckles, because they thought someday we're going to be in charge again, and we don't want the whole joint to be wrecked. So I don't know if I want to go this far. I don't know if I want to do this. But now we're at a point where the house is on fire, and it's deeply unsatisfying to a lot of voters, especially younger voters, when men and women who come from that older world say, well, yes, that is outrageous. And the way I responded to it, I wrote a strongly worded letter to the president. And it just drives them around the bend because they think, no, the roof's coming in. So we have to be like them. They got to be in charge of everything by sinking their teeth into our necks. And the only way we're going to be in charge is if we're ready to sink our teeth into their necks too. So that, yes, even the losers win by changing the rules of the game so that we're all at each other's throats. And I worry about that a great deal. I find the strongly worded letters unsatisfying too, but I also sit and watch masked men grabbing people off the street, and I realize something deeply problematic has changed about what undergirds how we think we're going to do business with each other in this country.
I spent a lot of my career in retail politics. I think there's some truth to what you say about the air war, you know, the macro messaging stuff, the kind of the red meat stuff. I have never knocked on a door in which what they want to hear is me screaming at them about how evil the other side is. Never, not once in my career. And I've never met a single voter. I've never met a single person I have persuaded by telling them how stupid they are and how wrong they are. I worry that we are mistaking a system which is full of malignant incentives that rewards incivility with amplification and visibility for effectiveness. And I'm not sure that they're the same thing. But I do see what you're saying. And I think that a politics that says we must sit back and take it because that's the right thing to do misses the fact that sometimes the civil thing to do is to actually tell the truth, to stand up to power, to confront, to stand in the way of people who are trying to hurt others. And that is always a dangerous, risky, and courageous, and decent, and good, and civil thing to do, always.
Good last word.
Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today, and thank you to NYU DC and the Bradimus Center for hosting us. Have a great Monday.
Okay.